Hello, Internet, and welcome back to another episode of Meet La Prensa. Today's guest is Leanne Alfaro, founder of Moneda Moves, which is what I think just a phenomenal project, unique in its space about money and the Latino community. So, Leanne, welcome to Meet La Prensa.
Thanks, Pablo. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm so excited.
So, tell me about Moneda Moves. Like, what is the origin story? How did it
Yeah, absolutely. So I made my entry into the professional world through journalism, and I fell into business journalism working at Business Insider and CNBC. And I noticed this big gap when we wrote about stories about money and business. We didn't write about people of color. It's almost like they were two different worlds and mutually exclusive. And I will say, when I started in the industry, 2015, 2016, it was a very different world, right? So we weren't talking about this mass exodus that we're seeing of women from the workforce. We also weren't talking about how the pandemic that we have going on is kind of exposing all these inequities even further in our system. However, I was acutely aware of this because I grew up in this environment. My parents were immigrants from Mexico, and we grew up a lower income family that could have been qualified for food stamps. And so I had a quick awareness of the importance of money and the importance of speaking about money, and how in the Latino community we kind of didn't speak about money, and media also didn't position us in these same worlds. However, I thought that we're such big contributors to the economy, we're such big small business generators, that there ought to be a platform where we report, where we talk about this, where we talk about the now growing community of people who want to talk about money.
What now do you wish you knew? Like, what do you know now that you wish you knew when you first started Moneda Moves? Like, what's the biggest lesson that you think that somebody else who was maybe starting something in another niche, like, what would they need to know moving forward?
Yeah, I would say that remember that the internet just moves really fast. And I think as journalists, we tend to turn things over 1,000 times in our head. But if you want to build something digitally and if you want to move online, you need to move quickly. Because especially what I've seen this year, it's just creators just go for it. And I will say there is a difference between just a creator and a journalist, but these paths intersect a lot. And so if you want to stay relevant, you need to maintain that production, and you need to not let the fear of failure keep you from that production. Consistency is probably the hardest part. And I will say what people say about doing a project intensely or entrepreneurship is true. It's that it's not a matter of having talent, it's a matter of being consistent, but also watching out for burnout. But I think it is important to continue putting your work out there, to be consistent. And I think that is the best way to build a community and stay relevant.
So, as a creator and a journalist in the space, then you're probably I think, the person who's interviewed the most Latina founders and CEO of anybody on the internet with Moneda Moves. So, as the expert, what are some things that you've learned from these women who you've interviewed? Like, what are and are there any commonalities of the challenges they faced, or some of the maybe assets that they bring to the table that other people haven't, that other people don't have, that they've been able to leverage toward their success in the field, in their fields?
Absolutely. So I think, as when we talk about the Latino bloc in general, no two Latinas are the same, all from very different backgrounds. And so it's important to recognize privilege. And I think a lot of the Latinas I've spoken with, especially for Moneda Moves, because of the platform and its mission statement, they are very quick to recognize their own privilege. This week, we'll have a podcast with Eliana Murillo. She is an ex-Googler who founded the Hola, the employee resource group, and then also Latinas Who Brunch in her own company Element, and also has a tequileria with her parents. She, for example, a serial entrepreneur, acutely aware of her privilege, checked herself in interviews. And so I will say, under this platform, we're able to have these more raw conversations about where it is that you come from and how that's affected your status now. That said, I do think that once you start raising capital and you start trying to build a business in a big scale kind of way, Latinas do come up against similar issues and similar challenges, one of them being raising funding. I mean, VC venture capital goes to less than 1% of Latinos. I think it's 0.4% of Latinas have received venture capital. And right now across the country, I do believe there are around a dozen prominent Latinas in VC. So the representation is just not there. And so the capital is really difficult to acquire because it almost is exclusively a game of who you know, and also
Well,
a game of confirmation bias where people tend to give money to people that think like them, that look like them, but mostly just come from the same circle. So I think when it comes to funding, that's a big barrier. I think scaling, so education is another big barrier. And this is something that I'm also trying to educate myself on right now. It's figuring out how to not just scale your business, but figure out what kind of business model you have, and making sure that you do know who it is that you're serving.
so one of the things that you talk about a lot in Moneda Moves is the creation of wealth. And it seems like one of the tones of the way that you talk about it is to teach somebody from the ground up what wealth is and how people create it. If what would you tell your parents if you could go back and talk to them at your age? Uh, what would you tell them that, kind of knowing what you would know, what you know now, to do differently? And what would you tell them to do the same, that you're really thankful that they taught you early on, some of the things that you picked up from them? Like, what about your childhood or what about your upbringing and money drives the passion, and purpose?
Yeah, I mean, I think my parents taught me a lot about purpose. As immigrants, they were both very passionate about moving here and about creating a new life and about setting down the roots for generational wealth. At least that's everyone tells themselves stories, and that's the story that I like to tell myself, because even though my it's funny, my mom and dad are kind of like very different people. My mom always taught me to be very conservative with my money. She taught me to save my money. Meanwhile, my dad was the kind of person that was just kind of like, I will work to the day I die. And if I don't spend money now, I may not have it tomorrow. So very not trusting of the system. To some extent, both of them, they were the kind of people that stowed money away under the bed in a box. And we did have these conversations early on where we learned together, and we started, being participants in the financial system. But I will say, in terms of advice that I could give them, I just don't know that I could give my parents any advice, because they did not grow up in this country and they were under just completely different circumstances than I am today. And so I think that in talking about money, especially as a first generation person, who also came from not wealth, I think it's important to talk about how that shapes who you are today. Like, I do think that purpose is a big part of the way that I build wealth. Like, I cannot divorce the two personally. And so that definitely shapes the way that I approach money.
In terms of access to capital, have you or any of the founders and CEOs, the Latina founders and CEOs who you've interviewed, thought about maybe applying to a Y Combinator or another institutional incubator for startups?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm doing currently a more less orthodox incubator of my own right now, or participating in one. But I have spoken with Latinas who talk about the significance in this. I do think, though, because of the target audience that I have, I wanted to do an alternative combinator, or not combinator, but an incubator that focused on my particular demographic. So that's why I'm doing a Latino focused incubator first, because my goal is to better get to know within the Latino demographic who it is exactly that I'm trying to target. So that's kind of my immediate goal right now, but I absolutely see myself in these spaces after speaking with so many of these women. And I do see myself, eventually raising money. But I do think that it helps, if there's anything I've learned from entrepreneurs and women entrepreneurs, is that it helps to have a clear vision of these bite-sized steps before you can get there. So be able to define your audience, and then from there work backwards and say, okay, what do they watch? What do they what do they read? How does this differentiate from everyone else that's online? Because I'm also acutely aware of the space that we're in. And I think it's important to remember, to people who are thinking about doing this, is that while there's been a lot of personal finance creators, and like, for example, you have Suma Wealth, you have all these fintech companies, no one's going to be able to be you. And so I'm kind of thinking about how I can further integrate myself in the brand, given my experience, and use that as an asset, which is, I've thought a lot about my audience. I haven't thought about as much as in my incorporation. As a matter of fact, because of my history as a journalist, I've taken myself out oftentimes. Like, I I use my logo, I don't use my face, but I am at kind of like at a place where I'm thinking about using myself incorporated in the brand a little bit more. And that's certainly something that the entrepreneurs have recommended that I do as well. And it's something that I've observed other Latinas do too.
Why the hesitation so far?
You know, I think it's because of my background in journalism. Like I don't want the story to be about me. I want it to be about the community. I see this as a platform about the growing community of people who are active in the money and business world. But I do see that there's a benefit. So I'm leaning into it. There's a benefit, and there's also like a growth opportunity of us growing together, of me growing together with this community that we're fostering, because there has been an explosion in people and Latinos interested in personal finance. The rates for certified financial professionals has been up more than ever in 2019, 2020, as well as Black CFPs. So I think that bringing your full self to the table pays off greatly. So that I'm just working on my strategy for that right now.
Awesome. So who are the most underrated news workers today?
Just across the board?
Across the board, every beat. Like you're in New York City, sort of the home of media in the United States and news media. And, you know, when you're out there seeing like people covering the business world, people are covering these massive companies, who do you think are the underrated workers? Like, is this a question we ask every time to a first-time guest?
Yeah. You know, I'm going to have to shout out Ruth Umo. She is a reporter who used to work for Forbes, and she's been reporting on diversity and inclusion ever since it was a beat. I didn't even know that it was a beat when I arrived in 2015, and I very quickly became aware of her because every publication you could imagine, she had a byline in it. She was also with me at CNBC, and now she is managing editor of a publication all about diversity and inclusion. Yahaira Jaques is a producer over at Reuters, and I just have to shout her out because not only she did not have a background in journalism when she started, and not only is she reporting on the stock market, she's reporting on business every day. She's also founded her own company in tandem, and you know how booked of a schedule reporters can have. So I'm just blown away by her ability to do this. And her company is called the Pinole Project. It's all about, it's a health food. So she's throwing herself into the business game. So I really admire the multi-hyphenates in this field. Bianca Graulo is based in Puerto Rico. She actually has never been based in New York as far as I know, but her work has blown me away. She's very active on TikTok, reporting on the island. And I think in New York, I became more aware of all of the issues happening at Puerto Rico and the lack of coverage that we have. So having her report on business deals, injustices, and like just a beat on the social justice system has been super, super important. And she's at this point an independent journalist. Those are some people off the top of my head, but the list goes on. Yeah, no, there's just a lot of impressive like women reporters. Victoria
Awesome.
Leandra is another person who's also a Boricua and reporting on Puerto Rico too.
So last question. Moneda moves a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Go.
I'm actually thinking about the next year. And if we start with the next year, in the next year, I do want to turn it into a contributor-based site. I want to partner with a fintech company. I think that fintech is going to be pushing a huge revolution for Latinos who during the pandemic we've seen don't have as much access to banks as they should. I think that they're going to be forging the relationships and forging the way. So I want to create or be in partnership with an actual tool, with a fintech tool, because I think that this is a huge space for growth that's going to need the content, that's going to need to build these relationships, and that's going to need to storytell in an authentic way, which is exactly what Moneda Moves sets out to do. So by 5 years, I fully expect that to be incorporated within a fintech tool. I expect that fintech tool to be significantly large because right now is the time for growth. Right now is the time where you have the Black and Latino population looking for these places that they can trust and looking for places where they can secure their wealth.
Awesome. Is there anything else you want to talk about today before we call it?
I mean, I would just say that personal finance is super intimidating to talk about with your parents, if you're first gen, or if you're breaking a cycle within your family. And you don't have to be Latino to resonate with this, I think. But I think it's difficult navigating finances, navigating those conversations. But I will say, personally, for my family, this has broached the subject for us. And so we have been discussing wills. We have been discussing home ownership, because we need to talk about what happens if somebody if somebody can no longer care for a home within our family. We talked about debt. I think that this is a really opportune time, even though you have to be vulnerable, but it's an opportune time to learn with your family. And even if you do not know, there's more resources than ever from people who may understand your background, may look like you. So I venture you to come out to Moneda Moves, visit the newsletter. I'm highlighting all sorts of personal finance creators. A lot of them are working towards CFPs right now, but also to just learn about what Latinos are doing in the business world. I urge you to think about yourself more than just a consumer and somebody that's marketed to you, and as a creator. And if you have an idea and a contribution, it's totally doable. I'm not saying quit your job. I'm just saying business is definitely a great pillar for wealth creation itself.
Amazing. Leanne Alfaro, founder of Moneda Moves. Thank you for coming on Meet La Prensa.
Thank you so much, Pablo.